The camps that dotted the American landscape held men who were watched carefully, certainly, but who were also fed, clothed, and treated according to the standards set out in the Geneva Convention. More than merely following those rules, though, the American approach often went beyond them. Prisoners found themselves welcomed in strange and uncomfortable ways into the rhythms of ordinary American existence. The gap between what they had expected and what they encountered became the real story, and for many of these men, it proved far more shocking than any rumor about women behind wire could have been. Consider the irony embedded in every interaction. The regime they had served built its entire mythology around images of decadent democracies too weak and corrupt to sustain themselves. Soldiers marching toward Africa had been warned that America was a hollow shell, that poverty lurked beneath the propaganda, that food shortages there rivaled or exceeded anything happening in the homeland. One diary seized from a soldier of the Africa Corps during the fighting in Tunisia contained stark warnings about what to expect if captured. The Americans, it said, starved their own people while drowning the world in lies about abundance. Yet within a matter of weeks after laying down their weapons, those same soldiers would find themselves confronted with cuts of beef so enormous they seemed more appropriate for artillery demonstrations than for feeding prisoners. This is not simply a story about meals and camp menus, though food plays a central role. It is a story about a different kind of battle, one fought not with bullets and shells, but with brisket and bottles of cola. It is about how daily exposure to plenty could accomplish what no leaflet or propaganda broadcast ever managed, slowly dismantling the certainty that Nazi ideology had constructed in the minds of these men. Years later, one former prisoner tried to put into words what he had felt during those first weeks. "What shocked me most," he said, "was watching Americans discard things we in the homeland would have treasured. Bread crusts tossed aside, potato peelings scraped into bins, bacon grease poured out as if it had no value at all." That shock, that fundamental disconnect between what he had been taught and what he was seeing, represented the first crack in a wall of belief that had seemed unbreakable. To understand how a barbecue in the heart of Texas could function as a weapon in democracy's arsenal, we need to trace the path these prisoners took from the beginning, back to the desert battlefields where they surrendered, to the long convoy routes across the Atlantic, and to everything they witnessed along that journey. What they saw during those transitions, and what they would continue to see afterward, would challenge and ultimately overturn everything they thought they understood about the world and their place in it. May of 1943 saw the dust settling across Tunisia as seemingly endless columns of exhausted German and Italian soldiers trudged into captivity under the watchful eyes of Allied forces. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's celebrated Africa Corps had fought with skill and determination, but the mathematics of war had caught up with them. Supply lines had been strangled, fuel had vanished from the depots, and Allied forces pressed forward with resources that seemed bottomless. In the span of just a few weeks, nearly 275,000 Axis troops laid down their weapons in what became one of the largest mass surrenders of the entire war. Many expected summary execution, or at best, brutal forced marches under the merciless desert sun. Instead, they were loaded into trucks, given water, and informed they were bound for a destination that seemed to exist beyond the realm of possibility. They were going to the United States. The journey began at ports like Algiers and Oran, harbors swollen with the liberty ships that had become the workhorses of American industrial might. These vessels had been designed to haul cargo, built quickly and efficiently in shipyards that seemed to produce them faster than they could be sunk. Now they carried human cargo instead, packed into holds that had been hastily modified to transport prisoners across the ocean. The conditions were cramped and uncomfortable, with the smell of salt spray mixing with sweat, damp wool uniforms, and the sour tang of seasickness that became a constant companion. In those confined spaces below deck, prisoners whispered to each other in tones that mixed disbelief with dark humor. "They are actually sending us to America," one man scrawled in a diary that would later be preserved in archives. "The land of milk and honey," or so the Führer claimed, he added with obvious sarcasm. Yet despite the skepticism, doubt gnawed at them. Even in the cramped holds of those ships, food trays arrived carrying portions that would have seemed generous in Europe. Bread that was soft and white rather than dark and coarse. Actual meat rather than the mystery substances that passed for protein in wartime rations. Even butter appearing on occasion. One soldier later recalled the cognitive dissonance of those meals. On the ship crossing the ocean, he said, "We ate better than we had at the front lines. I did not know what to make of it, and neither did anyone else." Above their heads, the Liberty ships moved in carefully organized convoys, surrounded by destroyers whose crews scanned the horizon for the periscopes of submarines. U-boat packs still prowled these waters, and the sound of depth charges rolling into the sea, followed by the eerie silence when no explosion came, reminded the prisoners that their lives now depended entirely on the competence of the enemy's navy. The irony was impossible to miss. German soldiers, being fed by American cooks, protected by American sailors, carried toward captivity in ships built by the very industrial arsenal their leaders had dismissed as weak and incapable. The voyage itself became a lesson in scale that no propaganda film could have prepared them for. The prisoners counted ships stretching across the ocean, sometimes seeing more than 100 vessels moving in coordinated lines that spoke of organization on a level they had not imagined possible. They watched cranes in Algiers unloading cargo with mechanical precision, then reloading supplies bound for the European theater. Numbers whispered through the decks like rumors. The Americans were supposedly building one Liberty ship every 3 days. For men coming from a homeland where bombs had destroyed factories and resources grew scarcer by the month, it felt like standing inside a machine that could not be stopped. An endless factory that simply produced and produced without pause. Yet in those dim holds that swayed with the motion of the waves, another paradox was growing alongside the disbelief. The guards were not cruel. They shared cigarettes during breaks, spoke casually about baseball games back home, about wives and sweethearts waiting for them, about farms in Kansas or sawmills in Oregon. For many prisoners, these interactions provided the first hint that their enemies were not the monsters shown in propaganda reels, but ordinary men wearing different uniforms. One prisoner later said it was the sound he remembered most vividly from that voyage. The clang of mess trays as food was distributed 3 times a day. That sound, he recalled, was what America meant to me during those weeks at sea. It meant I would eat. It meant I would survive. But the true revelation still lay ahead, waiting at the docks, where ships would unload their human cargo, and the prisoners would get their first glimpse of the abundance that had been described to them as a lie. Norfolk, Virginia, appeared through the morning mist in June of 1943, and for most of the German prisoners aboard, it represented their first actual view of American soil. What they saw as the Liberty ship glided into the harbor bore no resemblance to what they had been led to expect. Cranes towered like steel giants along the waterfront. Warehouses were stacked with goods visible even from the water. Train lines hummed with locomotives pulling endless strings of cars. And nowhere, absolutely nowhere, were there ruins, rubble, or broken glass. For men who had left behind cities pocked with bomb craters and buildings reduced to skeletal frames, it felt as though they had passed through a portal into another world entirely. The process of disembarkation moved quickly, but with obvious organization. Prisoners shuffled down gangplanks in lines, their boots making metallic sounds against the steel, and what struck them immediately was not hostility from the Americans, but rather efficiency. Trucks waited in neat rows. Red Cross personnel stood with clipboards and medical supplies, and the soldiers directing traffic carried papers rather than brandishing rifles. One soldier later tried to capture the feeling of that moment. "It felt more like being processed through a factory than being thrown into a prison," he said. Everything moved with precision, and everything seemed to exist in endless supply. Processing began with medical examinations that were thorough and professional. Doctors in clean uniforms, stethoscopes hanging around their necks, checked blood pressure, examined teeth, listened to lungs. Many of the prisoners, hardened by months of desert fighting, assumed this was some kind of pretext for humiliation or worse. Instead, they were weighed, measured and informed of their deficiencies and medical conditions, with a detachment that was almost clinical. The records from Norfolk tell a stark story. The average German prisoner arriving at that processing center weighed between 25 and 30 pounds, under what would have been expected for his height and build. Nearly 1 in 5 men showed clear signs of malnutrition. Some suffered from night blindness caused by vitamin A deficiency. Others had bleeding gums indicating scurvy. Rashes from pellagra covered the skin of some prisoners, while weakness from beriberi affected still others. The paradox must have cut deep. Men who had marched into war believing themselves to be elite warriors, representing the pinnacle of European civilization, were suddenly revealed, in cold medical terms, to be underfed and physically fragile. And then came the blow that none of them had anticipated. The food appeared, and it was real. Not crusts or scraps, but hot meals. Milk poured freely from metal containers. Bread arrived soft and white, nothing like the dark, gritty loaves they had grown accustomed to. Meat appeared in portions so generous that many prisoners at first suspected some kind of trick or performance. One man recalled the moment vividly. "We sat there waiting for someone to bring cameras," he said, waiting to be told this was all for show. But no one came. The food was real, and we were expected to eat it. In the processing camps around Norfolk, the menu consisted of standard army fare, but to men accustomed to deprivation, it might as well have been a feast. Scrambled eggs appeared on trays alongside fried potatoes. Beef stew came thick with vegetables and chunks of meat. Coffee flowed in quantities that seemed obscene, and for prisoners who had spent months or years drinking ersatz beverages made from roasted grain or chicory, the aroma of actual roasted coffee beans was almost intoxicating. Diaries from this period capture the psychological impact of these meals with brutal honesty. "Even their own soldiers cannot possibly eat like this," wrote a corporal who had come from Bremen. But they did eat like that, and this represented knowledge that could not be reconciled with everything the prisoners had been taught. The psychological weight of these meals cannot be overstated. German propaganda had painted America as a hollow giant, a nation incapable of clothing or feeding its own citizens properly. Yet here was evidence that the enemy not only fed its soldiers well, but extended nearly the same treatment to its prisoners. One doctor's report from the Norfolk Processing Center noted something remarkable. "Within weeks of arrival," he wrote, "the average prisoner weight increases by 10 to 12 pounds. Morale appears confused. Prisoners laugh as they eat, then fall silent afterward, as if afraid the food will be taken away." The processing centers also offered the first glimpses of American abundance in everyday items beyond food. Prisoners caught sight of warehouses stacked high with crates of fruit, tobacco, and even chocolate. They watched trains roll past the camp, each car filled with grain, coal, or machinery. The sheer scale of it all unsettled them in ways that were difficult to articulate. "We could not understand how they could have so much," one sergeant recalled years later, while simultaneously fighting a war across the entire world. The smells lingered in memory long after the events themselves had passed. Diesel fumes from the locomotives, pine tar from the wooden docks, and above all, the constant, inescapable aroma of food. To step off a ship half-starved and immediately breathe in the scent of roasting meat and freshly baked bread was to experience in one overwhelming sensory rush the collapse of an entire worldview. But Norfolk was only the beginning of the journey. Ahead lay long train rides pulling deep into the American interior through landscapes completely untouched by war. Fields green with growing corn, orchards heavy with fruit waiting to be picked, towns where shop windows gleamed with goods, displayed as if scarcity was not even a concept anyone considered. If Norfolk had begun to crack the facade of Nazi propaganda, the journey into America's heartland would smash it to pieces entirely. From the Norfolk docks, the prisoners were loaded onto long trains of Pullman cars, their windows fitted with bars but still open to allow air to flow through. The clatter of steel wheels against rails marked the beginning of the next chapter in their strange captivity, a journey across the American interior that would prove more astonishing to many of them than even the abundant food they had been given. The trains surged westward, passing through the Shenandoah Valley, where the landscape unfolded like something from a painting or a storybook. Out the barred windows lay rolling orchards heavy with apples hanging from branches, fields carpeted with alfalfa growing thick and green, barns painted in red and white that looked almost too perfect to be real. The men pressed against the glass, speaking to each other in hushed tones that mixed wonder with disbelief. Not a single bomb crater, one prisoner remembered. Not one ruin. For soldiers who had left behind cities where entire neighborhoods had been reduced to smoking rubble, the sight of American towns with intact roofs, children playing in streets without fear, families going about their daily business, represented a paradox almost too great to process. The sounds of that journey defined the memory for many who made it. The whistle of the locomotive echoing across hills and through valleys, the constant rattle of the tracks beneath their feet, and in between those mechanical noises, the completely unexpected sound of American families waving as the train passed. Sometimes children would run alongside for short distances, tossing pieces of chewing gum or chocolate bars through the bars of the windows. A corporal from Cologne later wrote about one such encounter. "I had not seen a chocolate bar in years," he said. "A child, an enemy child, gave me two, and I felt ashamed that their children had so much to spare while mine had nothing." As the trains rolled deeper into the South, the true scale of America became impossible to ignore. Endless miles of farmland stretched in every direction, cornfields reaching to the horizon, cattle grazing behind sturdy fences that seemed to go on forever. Irrigation ditches glistened under the sun, evidence of agricultural organization on a massive scale. For men who had grown up with ration cards and shortages, who had watched the homeland struggle to feed its people even before the war began in earnest, the abundance was staggering in its implications. The United States was not merely feeding its vast army deployed across the world, it was feeding millions of civilians at home, and still had enough surplus that waste seemed commonplace. One prisoner muttered a question that many of them must have been thinking. "If they can do all this," he said quietly, "if they can feed everyone and still fight a war on two fronts, how can we possibly win?" By late summer of 1943, many of these trains converged on Texas, where construction crews had raced against time to raise entire cities made of wood and wire. One of the largest was Camp Swift, located near Bastrop, a sprawling complex completed in barely 4 months through the kind of rapid construction that seemed to characterize everything Americans did. The camp covered thousands of acres, with rows upon rows of barracks, guard towers positioned at intervals, kitchens that served thousands, workshops for various tasks, and even a fully equipped hospital. By autumn of that year, Camp Swift held approximately 5,000 German prisoners, and more were arriving weekly. Camp Swift embodied the American paradox in physical form. It was a prison, certainly, with wire and guards and restrictions on movement. But to the prisoners themselves, it looked more comfortable than many of the barracks they had occupied as free soldiers serving the Reich. Electric lights glowed at night instead of dim oil lamps. Hot water poured from taps when you turned them. Latrines flushed with the simple pull of a handle, a luxury many German homes lacked. Each barrack contained stoves for winter heating and fans to move air during the brutal Texas summers. The mess halls served 3 hot meals every single day without fail. It was as if we had entered a modern world we had been told did not exist, said an Unteroffizier named Hans Müller in an interview conducted decades later. The sensory impressions of Texas burned themselves into memory with surprising clarity. The air carried the smell of mesquite and dust, distinctly different from anything they had known in Europe. Cicadas droned in the afternoon heat, creating a wall of sound that took getting used to. Evenings glowed with the smoke of cook fires drifting across the prairie, and the sky seemed bigger somehow, as if even the heavens were more expansive in this strange land. At first, the prisoners remained wary, still expecting harsh discipline or cruel treatment to begin once the initial processing was complete. Instead, guards spoke to them casually, sometimes even joking in broken German or through interpreters. They issued uniforms that were clean and well-made, bedding that was soft, soap that actually produced lather, and informed the men that work assignments would come soon. The paradox tightened its grip with each passing day. Here they were, prisoners of war, yet they were being treated with more dignity and material comfort than many had known as free men serving under the regime. They were captives behind wire, but they slept on mattresses stuffed with cotton, not straw, and they ate portions that left them feeling full rather than perpetually hungry. One diary entry recorded during this period captured the confusion perfectly. "We are behind wire," the prisoner wrote, "but in our stomachs, America feels like freedom." And then came the moment that would crystallize all this confusion and contradiction into a single, unforgettable experience, the invitation to witness an American ritual unlike anything that existed in Germany. The summer barbecue. It was here, around pits filled with glowing coals and meat sizzling over hickory smoke, that the last remnants of their old perceptions would shatter completely. July 4th, 1944. Camp Swift baked under a sun that blazed white in a cloudless Texas sky. Cicadas rattled in the trees with their usual afternoon intensity, and the smell of smoke began to curl above the wire as the day progressed. For the German prisoners, the date itself meant nothing. It was just another day of captivity, another rotation of sun and heat. For the Texans, though, it was Independence Day. And that meant celebrations built around food, music, and the gathering of community. By late afternoon, the paradox that had been building for months was about to unfold in its most visible form yet. Prisoners, marched out under guard to an open area near the camp, were about to witness a feast that contradicted every lesson the Reich had drilled into them about American weakness and scarcity. Rows of pits had been dug shallow into the earth, lined up with military precision. Inside each pit, hickory and mesquite coals glowed red, the smoke rising in thin streams that carried a scent both sweet and sharp. On metal grates suspended above these coals, massive slabs of beef brisket, some weighing 12 to 15 pounds each, hissed and dripped fat that sizzled and flared when it struck the embers below. The air became layered with scents that built on each other in complexity. Black pepper, paprika, garlic rubbed into the meat's surface, and underneath it all, the dark sweetness of brown sugar caramelizing in the heat. For men whose recent experience of meals had been limited to watery stews and coarse bread, the aroma itself was overwhelming, almost a physical presence. A local rancher named Buck Morrison, broad-shouldered and sunburned from a lifetime outdoors, lifted the lid of a steel smoker and used a long fork to spear a cut of meat. The bark on the outside was crisp and dark, while just beneath the surface, a pink smoke ring glowed like a badge of honor. He laughed as he displayed it to the watching prisoners, his voice carrying across the space between them. 12 hours, he announced, clearly proud of his work. Slow and steady, that is how you do it right. The Germans simply stared, some of them shaking their heads in disbelief. No one cooks meat for prisoners, one whispered to his companion. It makes no sense. Yet there it was, undeniable and real. Alongside the brisket came trays heaped with side dishes that seemed to multiply the longer you looked. Cornbread crumbled golden and rich with butter, beans that had been simmered with molasses until they were sweet and smoky, potatoes baked until their skins split open, revealing fluffy interiors. Jars of pickles sat next to bowls of coleslaw crisp with vinegar and flecked with fresh vegetables. Children darted between the tables, carrying bottles of Coca-Cola that hissed when the caps were pried off. These bottles cost 5 cents at any store, but today they were free, handed out to anyone who wanted one. The prisoners watched as American families piled food onto their plates, laughing, singing, offering portions across the invisible barrier that separated captor from captive. A teenage girl, perhaps moved by compassion or simple kindness, slipped a generous slice of peach cobbler to a stunned sergeant who accepted it with trembling hands. He would write about that moment later, his words preserving the emotional impact. "I thought of my sister," he wrote, "standing in a queue for bread in Hanover for hours." Here, they give dessert to the enemy. Music struck up as the afternoon progressed, adding another layer to the sensory overload. Fiddles scraped out familiar melodies, guitars strummed rhythms that were foreign to European ears, and a harmonica wailed its lonesome sound across the prairie. Country tunes rolled out over the landscape, mixing with the sharp pop of firecrackers and the low hum of hundreds of voices talking and laughing. Some prisoners found themselves clapping along, uncertain and embarrassed by their own response. Others deliberately turned away, unwilling to show emotion or seem to be enjoying themselves. But all of them felt the same weight pressing down, the same impossible contradiction of being fed like honored guests while confined as prisoners of war. The numbers behind this single meal reinforced the shock in ways that were hard to process. In Germany, ration books limited civilians to roughly 2 pounds of meat per week, and often the actual amount available fell short even of that meager allocation. Here, in the span of a single evening meal, men were offered more meat than their families back home might see in an entire month. Briskets weighing 15 pounds each were being roasted by the dozen. Hundreds upon hundreds of pounds of beef consumed in a single celebration. "This is not propaganda," murmured Dr. Wilhelm Huffman, who had served as a physician in the Wehrmacht and now found himself examining this abundance with a medical man's eye for detail. "This is their daily life, and it destroys everything we were told to believe." The taste lingered long after the meal ended, smoky, rich, tender beyond anything they had experienced in years. Brisket sliced thin with juices soaking into soft white bread. A corporal from Stuttgart recorded his thoughts in a diary that night. "I could not sleep," he wrote. "I had eaten so much that I felt sick. But it was more than being full. I was confused. Why do they feed us this way? We killed their sons, tried to conquer the world, and still they give us meat and kindness." That night, as fireworks cracked and bloomed above Bastrop in celebration of American independence, the prisoners lay in their bunks while the memory of barbecue smoke still clung to their clothes and hair. For many, it represented the first absolutely undeniable proof that America was not the land of poverty and desperation their leaders had described. The enemy had revealed its true weapon, and it was not brutality or vengeance. It was generosity, casual and seemingly endless. And yet, as significant as this single feast had been, it was only one encounter. The deeper shock, the one that would truly reshape their understanding, would come not from holiday celebrations but from the steady, relentless rhythm of daily life. in canteens where luxuries could be purchased, in pay slips that provided wages for work, in small comforts that prisoners never expected to hold in their hands. For all the spectacle of a 4th of July barbecue, it was the ordinary routine of camp existence that would prove most astonishing. For all the drama of a holiday feast, it was actually the daily rhythm that shocked the prisoners most profoundly. What they experienced day after day, reflected in menus, stamped into payment records, handed over in the form of small luxuries, made it impossible to deny that American abundance was not some special performance, but rather the ordinary pulse of the nation. Breakfast established the pattern from the very first day. Prisoners woke to the clang of bells, summoning them to mess halls where trays waited with eggs prepared in various ways, scrambled, fried, sometimes boiled, accompanied by oatmeal sweetened with actual sugar, toast spread thick with butter, and slices of bacon that were crisp and fatty. Coffee flowed without restriction, dark and hot, bearing no resemblance to the bitter substitute made from roasted acorns that had become normal in the homeland. To have real coffee every single morning, wrote a prisoner who had come from Munich, was more luxury than our generals enjoyed back home. Lunch and supper reinforced these lessons with monotonous regularity. Beef stews arrived thick with vegetables and chunks of meat you could actually identify. Fried chicken came crisp with seasoned batter crackling on the outside. Loaves of fresh white bread were baked right there on site, filling the air with yeasty warmth. Pies appeared filled with apples, cherries, or pumpkin, depending on what season it was. Peanut butter, that sticky, sweet, strange American invention, became a subject of endless fascination. One diary noted the evolution of opinion. "At first it disgusted me," the prisoner admitted. "Then I found I could not stop eating it. Even potato chips, a snack that had been invented only a few decades earlier, appeared in the camp canteens as if they were nothing special. And then there was the question of pay. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were entitled to receive compensation for any labor they performed. In American camps, this translated into tokens or scrip that could be redeemed at the camp canteen for various goods. With these earnings, men could purchase cigarettes, candy bars in bright wrappers, soap that smelled of flowers or spices, shaving cream, writing paper to send letters home, and most astonishingly, bottles of Coca-Cola chilled with actual ice. A sergeant from Bavaria tried to capture his feelings in writing. "I sat in the shade," he wrote, "drinking a Coca-Cola, listening to music on a radio. I thought to myself, this cannot possibly be captivity." The numbers shocked them as deeply as the luxuries themselves. The United States Army allocated to its prisoners of war nearly the same rations it provided to its own soldiers, roughly 3,500 calories per day. This compared to German civilian rations that had dipped to 1,500 calories or less by late 1944, and would fall even further as the war ground toward its conclusion. Where German families stood in queues for hours hoping to purchase a few ounces of butter, prisoners in America spread it thick on white bread without giving it a second thought. The disparity gnawed at them constantly, mixing guilt with disbelief, envy with unwanted gratitude. Even entertainment entered the picture in ways they had not anticipated. Camps maintained libraries stocked with American novels, German classics, even works by Goethe in translation. Film nights screened Hollywood pictures, westerns with cowboys and gunfights, comedies that drew reluctant laughter, sometimes carefully selected war films that avoided giving offense. Music drifted across the wire from various sources. Swing records played on gramophones. Church choirs practiced hymns. Visiting bands occasionally performed. Prisoners were permitted to form their own orchestras, to stage theatrical performances, even to paint murals on the walls of their barracks. For many men, the luxury that cut most deeply was simply freedom of movement within certain boundaries. Yes, barbed wire marked the perimeter. Yes, guards with rifles walked their routes at regular intervals, but inside that wire, men could walk across open fields, tend gardens they had planted themselves, even organize soccer matches that drew cheering crowds of fellow prisoners. In some locations, they were hired out as laborers to local farms or sawmills, riding in trucks past astonished townspeople who watched enemy soldiers waving like ordinary workers heading to their jobs. One guard remembered a conversation with a Texas farmer who had employed several prisoners for the harvest season. "Hell," the farmer had said with genuine appreciation, "those krauts work harder than the local boys I pay wages to." The contrast between what they had imagined and what they were actually experiencing grew starker with each passing week. Propaganda from the homeland had promised them a vision of America collapsing under rationing, a place of soup lines and desperate shortages. But the canteens full of goods, the payslips that accumulated, the Coca-Colas sweating in the summer heat, and the steady supply of butter and meat told another truth entirely. The daily shock was not found in spectacular feasts and celebrations, but rather in the casual, almost thoughtless abundance that characterized ordinary life. One prisoner attempted to summarize his experience in a letter that was censored, but fortunately preserved in archives. "If this is their normal existence," he wrote, "then we have been lied to far more deeply than we ever knew." And yet, the most startling encounters were still ahead. Not within the confines of the camps themselves, but outside those barriers, when prisoners walked American streets under escort, but essentially unshackled, and saw with their own eyes the prosperity of ordinary towns and the lives of everyday citizens. By the middle of 1944, something remarkable began happening with increasing frequency. German prisoners who had once braced themselves for punishment and starvation now found themselves climbing into trucks, not to labor under heavy guard in some hidden location, but to ride directly into American towns and cities. Their destinations were farms that needed workers, factories short on labor, sawmills processing timber, and sometimes even civic projects that required additional hands. The paradox was stark and undeniable. Men who had marched into war as would-be conquerors were now laborers in the very heartland of the nation they had been taught to despise and underestimate. What they saw astonished them far more than the work itself. Instead of ruined cities reminiscent of what they had left behind, or breadlines filled with desperate citizens, America revealed itself in the form of neat houses with painted porches, markets overflowing with goods, children riding bicycles with baskets full of fruit balanced on the handlebars. A prisoner who had come from Hamburg recalled with painful clarity his experience walking past a grocery store window in Kansas. "There was more meat hanging visible in that single shop window," he said, "than existed in all of Hamburg combined in an entire month. I thought perhaps I was dreaming or hallucinating." The scale of prisoner labor tells its own story. By 1945, more than 200,000 prisoners of war were employed as laborers across the country, contributing an estimated 45 million man-days of work to the American economy. They picked cotton under the Texas sun, harvested wheat across the endless plains of Nebraska, felled pine trees in the forests of Arkansas, built roads that stretched across the Midwest. Payment came not in American dollars, but in canteen coupons or scrip, yet even these represented wealth compared to what their families possessed back home. The paradox of perception deepened with every trip outside the wire. These were enemy soldiers, men who had fought against American forces, yet they were greeted with civility and sometimes even kindness that seemed incomprehensible. Farmers invited them to sit under shade trees and offered lemonade to cool them down. Church groups brought sandwiches and cookies. In rare but memorable cases, they were even offered home-cooked meals prepared in American kitchens. A woman in Minnesota later recalled her mother's reaction to the young prisoners working nearby. "They looked so young," she said, remembering the scene decades later. They looked exhausted. My mother could not help herself. She gave them bread and jam, and they thanked her as if it was gold or diamonds. But the shock carried another layer beyond simple kindness. The prisoners had expected hostility, had braced themselves for stones thrown, curses shouted, angry glares from citizens who had lost sons or husbands in the war. Instead, they encountered Americans who were clearly not starving, not beaten down by hardship, but thriving in ways they had been told were impossible. They rode in trucks past fields of corn that stretched farther than the eye could follow, grain elevators rising like towers against the sky, freight trains so impossibly long they seemed to have no end as car after car rolled past. The irony cut deep and painful. While they marveled at plenty surrounding them on all sides, letters from home painted pictures of desperate want. Rations in Germany had dropped below 1,200 calories per day for civilians by late 1945. Cities lay in rubble from bombing raids. Winter fuel was almost non-existent. Children fainted in schools from hunger. Yet here in America, prisoners rode through towns where bakeries threw away unsold loaves at closing time, where children bought ice cream cones with spare pennies found in pockets, where families gathered for backyard barbecues on weekends as if war was something happening on another planet. The effect was profoundly disorienting. We saw no poverty, one Bavarian prisoner later admitted in an interview. We saw no hunger, no despair, no signs of suffering. What we saw everywhere was a land that lived as if the war did not touch them at all. It was in those moments, riding through American towns on work details, that I finally understood. Everything we had been told, everything we had believed, was a lie from beginning to end. Still, some suspicion lingered among certain prisoners. Whispers circulated that perhaps the abundance was staged, that maybe the Americans were deliberately showing them only the prosperous areas while hiding poverty elsewhere. But each trip outside the camp, each work detail in a different location, confirmed the same reality over and over. Markets full of goods, factories busy with production, towns showing no damage from bombs, families living without visible fear or deprivation. Even the smell of the air told the story. Gasoline fumes from cars that seemed to be everywhere, grilled meat from countless cookouts, fresh bread baking in commercial ovens. These were scents of abundance impossible to manufacture as propaganda. The shock of those excursions proved greater than any feast or celebration behind wire. Within a camp, one might suspect that what was presented was illusion or performance. On American streets, watching ordinary life unfold, there was no denying the fundamental truth. The abundance was not propaganda created for their benefit. It was simply the ordinary rhythm of how Americans lived. And yet, as the war ground inexorably toward its conclusion and Germany itself collapsed into ruins, the prisoners understood that their time in America could not last forever. Soon they would be loaded onto ships again, ferried back across the Atlantic, and returned to a homeland that had been shattered in ways they could barely imagine from behind the wire. Back to cities that were starving, to families who could scarcely comprehend what their sons and husbands had witnessed in captivity. By late 1945, the great reversal had begun in earnest. Trains rumbled once more across the American landscape. But this time, they carried not men arriving fresh from battlefronts, but rather prisoners being transported toward ports for the journey home. From there, convoys of liberty ships would ferry them back across the Atlantic to a Europe that had been transformed by total war. Only this time, there was no mystery about what awaited them on the other side of that ocean voyage. Germany was not the land of prosperity and strength that propaganda had once described. It was a devastated wasteland of bombed cities, hollowed factories standing like skeletons, and ration cards that promised more than the system could possibly deliver. The contrast between departure from America and arrival in Germany was heartbreaking in ways that few had anticipated. In America, a prisoner might have eaten 3 eggs for breakfast without thinking about it. washed down with coffee and a full glass of milk. In Hamburg or Cologne, his family considered themselves fortunate to share one egg among 4 hungry mouths. In camp, he had bought Coca-Cola or chocolate bars with the scrip he earned from labor. At home, his children waited in endless lines, hoping for turnips or bread so adulterated with sawdust it barely deserved the name. It felt like falling from heaven directly into hell, one returnee recalled upon finally stepping onto German soil again. The statistics bore out their despair with brutal clarity. By 1946, average daily rations in occupied Germany had fallen below 1,000 calories in most zones, sometimes dropping as low as 800 in the British sector. Malnutrition spread rapidly, affecting especially the young and the elderly who had the least resilience. Black markets thrived as the only way many families could supplement their official rations. For men returning from a land where even prisoners had been fed steaks and pies, where abundance had been so casual it seemed almost wasteful, the shock of seeing their homeland was almost unbearable. A diary kept by a former prisoner who had been held in Nebraska recorded his first days back home with painful honesty. "My wife looked older than I remembered," he wrote. "My children had grown thin. I could not find the words to explain to them that in prison, as a captive of the enemy, I had eaten better than they did in freedom." And yet, amid all the guilt and hunger and devastation, something else lingered in the minds of these returning men, a memory of what they had witnessed, of what they had experienced during those years behind American wire. They had lived under a democratic system that treated its enemies with fundamental decency and respect. They had lived in camps that allowed prisoners to earn pay for their work, to read books of their choosing, to play soccer and form orchestras, even to taste barbecue at national holiday celebrations. They had seen supermarkets overflowing with goods, farms operating without apparent shortages, civilians living without the constant fear of bombs falling from the sky overhead. The paradox crystallized in their minds as they tried to rebuild lives in the ruins. They had marched into war as conquerors, believing themselves to be masters of a decadent and crumbling nation that would collapse at the first real test. They left America humbled and convinced that the nation's greatest weapon had not been its tanks rolling across battlefields or its planes filling the skies, but rather its abundance, its casual ease, its ordinary prosperity that continued even while fighting a global war. One veteran tried to summarize the experience in an interview conducted decades later when enough time had passed to gain perspective. "We were defeated twice," he said thoughtfully. "First by their armies on the battlefield, which we expected, then by their way of life, which we had been told did not exist." Some of these former prisoners carried the lessons they had learned into the monumental task of rebuilding Germany from the ashes. They returned with a new and hard-won respect for democracy, for fairness in governance, for the possibilities that peace could offer when combined with the right system. Historians examining the post-war period have noted how the prisoner of war experience became a quiet but genuinely real influence in the process of reconciliation between former enemies. They had seen a possible future, one scholar wrote in analyzing this phenomenon, because in America, even as captives behind wire, they had lived inside it and tasted it and could not forget it. The story of German prisoners of war held in the United States is ultimately not a tale of cruelty or deprivation, the expected narrative of captivity. Instead, it is a story built on paradox at every level. Enemy soldiers arrived expecting chains and found themselves handed bottles of Coca-Cola instead. They braced for rations consisting of crusts and scraps and discovered barbecue feasts that exceeded anything they had known even in peacetime. They anticipated propaganda designed to break their spirits and instead found daily truth written plainly in the language of calories consumed, pay slips accumulated, and markets overflowing with goods that seemed impossible. In the end, the barbed wire that surrounded the camps rusted away. The temporary cities of wood and canvas emptied as their inhabitants were shipped home. The men scattered back to their former lives or tried to build new ones from the rubble. But the memory endured, carried forward through decades, passed along in stories told to children and grandchildren, and embedded in that memory was a lesson that echoed across the years and across the ocean. America's true might lay not solely in the bombs it could drop or the factories it could build, though those were formidable indeed. The real power resided in its ability to show an enemy a different kind of strength entirely. The power found in plenty rather than scarcity. The power embedded in freedom rather than oppression. The power that radiated from ordinary life lived without fear, without hunger, without the constant shadow of violence overhead. In the final analysis, America's greatest weapon against the ideology these men had served was not found in its arsenal of destruction. It was found in the simple, undeniable reality of abundance shared even with those who had sought to destroy it.